In the UK, there is no service more valuable than our National Health Service, or NHS. Established in 1948 to provide free healthcare to the UK, it's fair to say it's responsible for saving millions of lives every year. However, in 1975, in the suburbs of Manchester, a monster would abuse his power and trust of his patients for his twisted amusement. A man who was nicknamed Dr. Death would take the lives of so many patients that to this day we still don't know the exact number of victims, and for 23 years he went completely undetected, preying on the elderly, knowing nobody would ever question what happened. Now let's dive in to the sick and twisted mind of Harold Shipman. Hey up weirdos, welcome back. My name is Repulsive Artichoke, despite what it says on the sign behind me. And this is the world of weird, where we investigate all things dark and bizarre, from cryptids to cults and even a little bit of true crime. Today we are going to talk about a case that is local for me and started off in my hometown of Leeds. And this crime was so huge that the investigation actually took about 4 years altogether. In fact, during the later years of his career, I had a family member who actually worked in the same speciality of the NHS that Harold Shipman did, which is very bizarre, and it even had knock-on effects in their job. Now, because of how many potential victims there are affected by his crimes, there is just no way I can discuss all of them, but I will be discussing some of the ones that were confirmed. And because this is such a sensitive topic, I'm not going to use the patients' and victims' real names. They are available online, so if you really want to know them, you can, but this is just the most respectful way that I feel I can do this for the families, because at the end of the day, people have lost loved ones, so we're going to be using pseudonyms for everyone in this case. I also just want to remind everyone that this is a very heavy topic, so just keep that in mind, and if it's too much for you to listen to right now, I can completely understand that. Just take care of yourselves and we'll see you in another episode. Now, for this episode of World of Weird, you're going to have to grab yourself an emotional support companion. I have Link sat down here by me. Let's get into the sick and twisted mind of Dr. Death. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on the 14th of July 1946. Side note, as a fellow Cancer, I can speak for all of us in the star sign community that we don't claim him. Anyway, back to Shipman. He was born in a council estate in Bestwood, Nottingham. He was the second of 3 children, and he had a very working class upbringing. And it's said he had a very close relationship with his mother. Unfortunately, when Harold was 17, his mother was diagnosed with lung cancer, and in the late stages of her battle with cancer, his mother would have home visits from a doctor who would administer morphine for her to help her deal with the pain. Keep that in mind because it is going to come up later. And Harold would see what this did for his mother, and it would go on to affect him for the rest of his life. On the 21st of June 1963, Harold's mother lost her battle with cancer, and it's said that it was very traumatic for Harold, as it would be any child, but because of the closeness between the two, it just obviously was a lot for him to deal with. But at the same time, it did actually end up sparking his interest in medicine. So 2 years later, he would be accepted to the University of Leeds. I'm sure they're thrilled about that now, where he would begin his foundation program. For anyone that is American and doesn't know what a foundation program, it is essentially the equivalent of the internship. Correct me if I'm wrong though, because this was just, I had to Google that. I don't know how to become a GP. I've worked in medicine, but not in that side, all on the admin side. In November of 1966, 19-year-old Harold would meet his then 17-year-old wife, who he would go on to have 4 children with. Harold's early career would begin at Pontefract General Infirmary, which is out sort of near Wakefield and Barnsley. Eventually, though, he would be hired at Abraham Ormerod Medical Centre in a quiet little village called Todmorden, which is kind of in between Leeds and Manchester. It's genuinely a lovely little village as well. In 1975, Harold was caught forging prescriptions for pethidine, I believe it's how it's said, which is essentially a synthetic opioid for people that have pain management problems. All that had come from this would be a £600 fine, a brief visit to rehab, and a slap on the wrist from the GMC. They regret that one now, don't they? After this, he would go to work as a GP at Donnybrook Medical Centre in Hyde, which is in Manchester, in 1977. And then he would just blend into the community, portraying himself as the hard-working, caring doctor and family man. But deep down, inside, a monster was hiding, who would later go on to destroy this community. It's said that Harold had a little bit of an anger issue, and he would have mood swings, which the staff at the medical centre would describe as violent. This would eventually lead to him having to set up a single-handed practice in 1992. If you're unfamiliar with a single-handed practice, it's where a GP will set themselves up as the principal doctor, and they essentially would just be contracted by the NHS, but they themselves would be essentially a one-man business. Mainly, they'd have some sort of receptionist or admin staff to help them out, but they would essentially just be working out of still a regular GP's surgery. On the 6th of March 1995, an 81-year-old elderly victim, who we are going to call Doreen, was visited by Shipman. The morning that Shipman's visit occurred on, Doreen had been chatting and having tea with her friend. If you hear any growling, it's just Zelda playing with a bottle. During the visit, the friend stayed in another room, so Shipman was completely unaware of her presence. During this appointment with Doreen, Shipman would inject her with a fatal dose of diamorphine. Diamorphine, which is the medical term for a drug that shares a same name with a female hero, let's say, because YouTube ain't gonna like it if I use the real word, but I will put it on screen. He had actually prescribed Doreen with 1,000 milligrams of morphine a week prior to this appointment occurring. Now, just bear in mind that the standard dose would be 5 milligrams, and a fatal dose is considered to be 30 milligrams. So, yeah, 1,000's gonna do quite a bit. Hello, editing Artichoke here. Firstly, I just want to say I am an idiot and I said 1,000 milligrams when it should have been 30. Don't know where the hell I got that number from and where I wrote that into the script. So, yeah. Also, it's diamorphine, not morphine, and I've said morphine every single time here. So please just remember I am saying diamorphine. Doreen's friend was quoted saying that everything went quiet for about 5 minutes. Yes? I'm sorry if I stopped paying attention to you. This is why it takes me so long to do videos. This is why I need a month just to do a single video, because this happens. Doreen's friend was quoted as saying that everything just went quiet for about 5 minutes. And when she decided to go into the living room where the appointment had taken place, she startled Shipman and then found Doreen motionless in a chair. When she confronted him about what was happening, Shipman went on to tell her that her friend had passed away and he was looking for a phone so he could call an ambulance and her next of kin. And Shipman contacted Doreen's... I really should have done this when the dogs weren't in. When Harold contacted Doreen's son, he claimed, "Shipman told me that he came to visit my mother. took her blood pressure, went out to the car, and then came back in to my mother's house to find her dead. Initially, he'd said that my mother suffered from a stroke. However, later he changed his mind to a heart attack. If that doesn't say sus and red flags, I don't know what else will. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I did work in the medical field for almost a decade. Oh God, that makes me feel old. I've pretty much worked in the medical field my entire working life. Anyway, to my knowledge, heart attacks and strokes are two very, very different things. One originates in the brain, the other originates in the heart. Yes, they can have ties to each other, but it would be one or the other for a main cause of death. From a death certificate perspective, I also just want to highlight what her son had said about her, because it's just absolutely heartbreaking. My mother was very sprightly. She was involved in the pensioners club and she arranged all the holidays there. She would book coaches to take them to the Lake District in April and then went away again with them in October. My mother was a lovely woman. She was full of beans and the backbone of hide. I used to take her shopping and I couldn't keep up with her. My mother had lots to live for and she had many friends. She was looking forward to the next holiday that she and her friend had booked the morning that she passed. Doreen would be the first of Shipman's victims that we know of, only 18 months after joining his practice. Just over a year after Doreen's passing, Shipman would have a visit with a patient who we will call Beryl. Beryl was found deceased, fully clothed on her bed after a neighbour came over to check on her shortly after Shipman's visit. In fact, Shipman was the one who had contacted them. He asked them to go help Beryl pack her belongings as she was getting admitted to hospital. He'd even said to wait a few minutes before going. Not sus at all. Later on, Beryl would be found to have morphine in her system. The next victim, who we will call Betty, was stated by Shipman to have died at home from pneumonia on the 28th of February 1997. Or at least that's what he claimed. Unfortunately, I couldn't find out exactly what actually happened, but because she was confirmed a victim, we know that this wasn't natural causes. He also said he'd called for an ambulance. He hadn't, because why? That would mean him doing his job. Unfortunately, there wasn't much information I could find on this lady. However, I was able to find that she was a retired seamstress and she was 77 at the time of her passing. The next patient, who we will refer to as Mary, was seen by Shipman on the 25th of April 1977 after a friend and neighbour had contacted him because Mary had been suffering with a cold for a while. The neighbour went to visit the patient just after Shipman left and she found her friend deceased. However, when the ambulance arrived at the home, the ambulance worker said that she had been deceased for some time. Shipman contacted the patient's husband by telephone to tell him that his wife was dead. It's such a soft and respectful way to do that, isn't it, Harold? Give him a ring. Now, this one is going to get more infuriating somehow. Shipman would have an appointment at his surgery on the 29th of May 1977 with a lady who we will call Sue. However, she never actually left his office because Shipman would see 3 more patients and then he would nonchalantly tell his receptionist that Sue was dead. He had failed to resuscitate her, need to call an ambulance. Morphine was later found in her body. She was actually a regular there at the surgery. Shipman would even go on to tell the police sergeant that she was a nuisance. He joked that part of the seating area should be reserved for her and have a plaque put up. Not only did this waste of space complain about a woman who was unwell, but to make a remark like that is just disgusting. I know some patients can be a bit annoying when you see them so much, but Jesus Christ, dude. Next was an 81-year-old lady who we will call Cindy. Cindy passed away on the 9th of December 1997. Once again, she was visited by Shipman and he injected her with morphine. However, it does get worse from here because Shipman's target at this point wasn't even Cindy. Cindy had a daughter-in-law who we will call Tracy, and Shipman's actual target was Tracy's mother, not her mother-in-law. Yeah, he took the life of the wrong person. So instead of taking Tracy's mother, he would take her mother-in-law. Why on earth did he manage to go undetected? 23 years. He's a moron. How on earth do these morons become GPs? How did he actually become a doctor? Because, my God. So after Shipman's major fudge up, he then put on Cindy's record that she had passed due to heart disease, which Tracy's mother did actually have because he went after the wrong woman. Cindy didn't actually have heart disease, so that would be bizarre discrepancy on Cindy's medical history. The following day, after taking Cindy's life, he would then visit another lady named Helga. Now, Helga was only 49, which, yeah, 49. Bit bizarre because his usual prey is the elderly. So why would he go after Helga? Well, background, Helga was originally from Germany and she had a hugely busy social life and was very loved in her community. Helga was discovered in her home by her son on the 11th of December 1977. Her death was obviously a tragic shock to everyone she knew, and for some reason she held Shipman in high regard and had even been a patient with him for 15 years. In her cause of death, it was listed as heart disease once again, which she did actually have down in her medical records because Shipman put it there after taking her life. She didn't even have heart disease, really. It was just in the records, alongside the other things to indicate that she had ill health. However, the toxicology report showed her cause of death of actually being a diamorphine overdose, because apparently that's his favourite pastime. But why did Harold target a barely 50-year-old woman who was enamoured by him and was just so happy to stroke his ego? Well, weirdos. Helga's ex-husband, who she was very close with and still had a very good relationship with, came out and said that a few months before she passed, she considered leaving money to Shipman in her will. However, just literally a few days later, she would change her mind and never had the paperwork dealt with by a solicitor. If there's any sort of silver lining here, it's that he never saw a penny from this woman because he did not deserve anything. After this, Harold took a couple of weeks off because, Christmas was around the corner and so he waited until mid-January to start again. His next target, I'll call Isabel, a 65-year-old who visited him at the surgery after she had developed a cough and chest pains. So she was given cough medicine. Later that day, Shipman visited her at home, and shortly after, her son found her slumped over in an armchair, which was just so bizarre to her son. Son said, I finished work at 2 p.m. I finished work at 2 p.m. that day. She had been to see Shipman and I finished work at 2 p.m. that day. She had been to see Shipman and had gotten cough medicine from him, which was unopened. I left to feed some ponies just before Shipman's visit, so to come back and find her lifeless in an armchair was a shock. Not long after Isabel's passing, a sister confronted Shipman at his surgery because she wanted an explanation. He explained to the sister that he was called out because she took a turn. You don't say. Once the sister left, Shipman turned to the receptionists and said, I told you this was going to happen. I can't with this dude, seriously. Harold's next victim was Angela. Angela was 57 years old at the time and had already been diagnosed with cancer. However, her family said that she hadn't been having symptoms or adverse effects of the cancer at the time. Once again, Shipman lied about her cause of death, saying it was due to the already existing brain tumour. But again, it was an overdose given by Shipman. Joan was a 73-year-old widow who had been one of Harold's patients for 18 years, which just again shows how much he used his charisma to deceive his patient, who were mainly elderly people, and unfortunately they were very, very vulnerable. Joan was found on the 9th of May 1998 in an armchair, and she had a sleeve rolled up, which was his way of staging the scene to suggest that Joan was taking intravenous substances. Once again, he changed her medical history to reflect this and put the cause of death as coronary thrombosis, which is basically a heart attack. Again, apparently all of his female patients have got a lot of plaque in their arteries. Maybe it's something in the water there. Clara was an 83-year-old divorcee who Shipman visited at her home on the 12th of June 1998. She was found unresponsive by a neighbour in her living room. Earlier that day, Clara visited Shipman at his surgery about a chest infection. Shipman issued a death certificate stating that she had passed from pneumonia and emphysema, which, keep in mind, she had no history of emphysema. The body would later be exhumed and she was found to have morphine in her system at the time of her passing. The GP also claimed to have phoned for an ambulance, but the ambulance records do not reflect that because he can't change those. Lastly, I want to discuss a lady that I will call Anne. Anne was the former mayoress of Hyde. She was found on the 24th of June 1998. She was fully clothed on a settee at home. Shipman killed her with a morphine overdose on a visit to take a blood sample. Once again, after Anne's passing, her medical records were changed, this time to suggest that the widow was addicted to morphine. But then he signed the death certificate, the certificate's cause of death being old age. Anne was 81, and old age is usually given to people of the age of 80 where there is no other explanation for their passing. But apparently Harold had forgotten that morphine is traceable in a toxicology report. In the late 90s, a local undertaker started to notice that there was an unusually high rate of patients under Shipman who would pass away under similar circumstances. They'd all be clothed, sat up in their sofa or on an armchair, and alongside all this, there was a very high rate for cremation forms that would require a co-signature. Oh, and the majority of these patients were elderly women. This concerned the undertaker enough for them to actually confront Shipman about it, but he just brushed it off and reassured them that there was nothing to be concerned about. Sure, okay pal, whatever you say. However, Anne, the former mayoress that I mentioned, would be Shipman's downfall. You see, Anne's daughter, who I'm going to call Amy, was actually a solicitor, And one day, Amy's co-worker approached her about her mother's will. Apparently, they had received a will that was supposedly written by her mother, Anne, but the colleague didn't feel like this was authentic due to the fact that this will left nothing to Amy or Amy's children, but left almost £400,000 to Shipman. Amy would actually report this to the police, however.
Police in Tameside in Greater Manchester are investigating the deaths of 20 people who are all patients of the same GP. The GP involved in the inquiry is Dr. Harold Shipman, who has practiced in this surgery in Hyde for more than 20 years. Police say that this is not a murder investigation and no one has been charged or arrested.
However, Shipman wouldn't actually be arrested until 3 months later, in September of 1998.
There's no question, he did nothing. He did nothing. But no one else will say any different, I can tell you that now.
If you were to ask any patient of Harold Shipman, who I've known for some 20 years as my GP, they would only see him like I see him, as an extremely hard-working and caring GP.
Talk's cheap, isn't it, in a village like this? I mean, all sorts of rumours go around. And as I say, I feel my heart goes out to Dr. Shipman. It really does, and until something is proved, then I think everybody's sort of saying he's guilty before he's even been seen, probably by the police. And I don't like it very much.
Shipman was already under investigation with the NHS because of the high rate of patient mortality in his own practice, as I mentioned with the coroner. So when the police started looking around his practice and home, they discovered some interesting items, such as a Brother typewriter, which was what the forged will was created with, and as well as some other things that I'll mention later. There are theories that sit around why he made the will, mainly suggesting that he had forged the will so that he could retire and flee the country without having to answer to the court about what he did, because he doesn't like taking accountability.
Dr. Harold Shipman was brought to Tameside Magistrates Court to face charges of murdering an elderly patient and forging her will.
A family doctor from Manchester, who was charged last month with murdering one of his patients and forging her will, has appeared in court accused of killing 3 more women.
The Greater Manchester GP, Dr. Harold Shipman, has been charged with another 7 murders. Dr. Shipman is already accused of killing 8 patients, and he'll face one of the largest murder trials in British history.
Shipman would go on trial in October of 1999, charged with 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. His lawyer did try to have the forgery put in its own separate case, which is hilarious because they clearly thought that the best strategy to make him look better was to have the forgery tried separately from the murder. Like, why? It's not gonna make... I'm sorry, did I say pudding? Like, it just doesn't make sense, does his thinking around this, because it's just not going to make you look any better. Like, I mean, he's killed 15 people, but at least he didn't do any forgery at the same time. Like, why would you think that was going to work? Anyway, or, you know, the other reason could have just been that he was potentially trying to get that yeeted or something. I don't know. Either way, the judge wasn't going for it, so they would be put together still. Shipman pled not guilty because obviously he's not going to admit to anything because the dude's a narcissist. But after 15 days of deliberation, Shipman was found guilty on all 15 counts of murder and the 1 count of forgery. I guess that didn't make you look any better, did it, mate?
Ladies and gentlemen, in commenting on the conviction of Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman, I would like to address 3 specific issues. The first is an expression of sympathy from myself and the officers engaged on the investigation for all the victims, their families and their friends. I hope that today's result will help them come to terms with their loss and the circumstances surrounding the death of their loved one.
The conviction today of Harold Shipman is the culmination of 19 months hard work by the prosecution team. The Crown Prosecution Service, the police and prosecuting counsel have worked together to bring to justice the most prolific serial killer this country has known.
So, prior to his sentencing, in the UK, it was decided that the British government would no longer be allowed to set the minimum tariffs for prisoners. However, just 2 months before this change was put in place, David Blumkett, who was Home Secretary at the time, granted the judges whole life tariff. So he received 15 life sentences and 4 years for the forgery of the will. And the whole life tariff would mean he would never actually leave prison. However, I don't feel like 4 years for the forgery is enough. I think that's actually awful. But like everything in the UK, the prison system is full to the point that I think it was last year that they decided that they were going to stop giving PDF files and essays prison time because they were full. It's a joke, honestly. One thing there is to note here though, UK life with no parole is not given out lightly. Right now, there are only 70 people in the whole country serving full life tariffs, and Shipman ended up serving his sentence at HMP Wakefield, which is also affectionately known as the Monster Mansion, and is currently known to the most well-known PDF file in the alternative community, Ian Watkins, who is the former lead singer of the band Lost Prophets. Don't worry, his video's coming. Whilst in prison, Shipman would actually become really good friends with another British serial killer, Peter Moore, also known as the Man in Black. I may cover that at one point, but I'm not sure, so let me know if you're interested in that one. Shortly after his sentencing, he was struck off of being a doctor by the GMC, but in my opinion, this should have happened way back when he was investigated the first time, because at this point, we don't know 100% how many victims there are. I mostly saw between 150 to 300, but he initially just got a slap on the wrist, which obviously escalated a little bit. The NHS then conducted a 6-part report, which would be called the Shipman Inquiry, which was headed by Janet Smith, who is a barrister and former High Court judge. In the 6th and final part of the report, issued in January 2005, because that's how long it took to deal with him, it was reported that Shipman had actually killed 3 patients, and she had a serious suspicion about 4 further deaths, including that of a 4-year-old girl during the early stage of his medical career at Pontefract General Infirmary. In total, 459 people died whilst under his care between 1971 and 1998. But it's uncertain how many of those were his victims. Like I said before, it was quoting between 150 and 300 number of victims, but that also adds in the fact that he was often the only doctor to certify a death. So Smith's estimate of Shipman's victim count over a 27-year period was 250. The GMC ended up charging 6 other doctors who signed cremation forms for Shipman's victims with misconduct, claiming that they should have noticed this pattern between Shipman's home visits and his patient deaths. All of these doctors would end up being found not guilty. And for me, that kind of feels like it's bittersweet, because at the end of the day, they couldn't have seen this coming. But at the same time, they should have kind of noticed the pattern and maybe inquired about that pattern. In October of 2005, a similar hearing was held against 2 doctors that worked at Tameside General Hospital in 1994. Detect Shipman had deliberately administered a grossly excessive dose of morphine, and the Shipman Inquiry recommended changes to the structure of the GMC. In 2005, it came to light that Shipman had also been stealing from his victims on top of all this. Police seized over 10k in potentially stolen jewellery during the search of his house and practice. However, there wasn't much point in doing anything about this because, as I said, he was never going to leave prison, and it would just mean more cost to the public with trials and whatnot for him to still never leave prison. And in true Shipman fashion, in January of 2004, Shipman would take his own life in his cell at HMP Wakefield just 4 years into his sentence. When this happened, obviously some people weren't happy, as essentially he was escaping his crimes without actually answering any of the questions about why he did it or even accepting any responsibility for what he did. One thing that is interesting that happened with Shipman's death is that David Blumkett, who I mentioned earlier, admitted that he was, quote, he was tempted to celebrate his death, quote, "You wake up and receive a call telling you that Shipman has topped himself, and you think, is it too early to open a bottle? And then you discover that everybody's upset that he's done it." Don't say. His death did actually divide headlines. The Daily Mirror called him a cold coward. However, The Sun celebrated it, making it front page news, titled "Ship, Ship, Hooray." I know that this is a pun on his name, but this one does not make sense to me. Yes? Can I finish this, please? I'm nearly done, I promise. One thing that really annoyed me was when he died, his wife received his full NHS pension, which she wouldn't have gotten if he'd lived past 66. I know she wasn't the one committing these crimes, but honestly, she was very supportive of him and stuck by him through it all. Honestly, if it was up to me, I would have donated it to the families of the victims, but that's just my opinion. Despite Shipman no longer being alive, there was still just so much fallout from all this, and not the fun kind with ghouls and the Mothman. The NHS scrapped the single practice surgeries, with a lot of people around my neck of the woods, which a lot of people around my neck of the woods weren't happy about because of money, shockingly. I mentioned I knew a few people that worked in similar sectors of the NHS, and they've said that this was able to go under the radar so much due to how much pressure our healthcare is under, and the targeting of the elderly was possibly due to the fact that they don't always have a post-mortem. In July of 2005, a garden was opened in Hyde for the victims of Shipman, which is kind of nice, but I feel like safeguarding would have been a bit better. And just to add to the stupidity that has happened in this case, back in 2009, families of over 200 victims of Shipman were still seeking compensation for the loss of their relatives. And just to add to the stupidity of this case, back in 2009, families of the victims were still seeking compensation for the loss of their relatives. And in September of 2009, letters Shipman wrote in prison to friends and family and the media were set to be sold at auction. However, the sale was withdrawn due to complaints from the victims' relatives and the media. It shouldn't have to be pointed out by victims' families that you are being disrespectful. Anyway, this is just horrific, and I seriously hope that the victims' families got some sort of compensation, or at least an apology, because from what I can find, it doesn't look like there was anything. With any luck, there was one, and it just happened away from media. No one deserved this, and in my opinion, it all stems from Shipman's mummy issues, and taking his own life was a coward's way out. I wouldn't normally say something about someone who did that, because we all have our issues with mental health problems, but he deserves it. He doesn't deserve anyone's sympathy, and I hope nothing but the worst for his spirit. I hope his victims' families are able to get some sort of closure, or something, because no one should ever have to lose a loved one because of some old cunt who wanted to play God. Anyway, I am gonna end this video before my channel gets deleted, before it even gets started. So yeah, I hope you all feel as enraged as I do now. So remember to like and subscribe, because it won't cost you anything, except maybe your sanity. But let's be honest, you wouldn't be here if you had any of that, would you? See ya.